3. The Flying Tigers. In China, the nationalists of Chiang Kai-shek and the communist forces put aside their differences in order to team up against the Japanese. From the beginning, China was at an extreme disadvantage because its country lacked air support, leaving them seemingly defenseless to Japanese bombings. However, U.S. Army aviator Claire Lee Chennault decided to lend his expertise, as he'd been in China since the mid-1930s. He was known for being opinionated, controversial, and extremely daring. He challenged his superiors on more than one occasion, which resulted in his forced early retirement. But he also suffered from health issues, and he was ultimately medically discharged from the Army Air Corps in 1937 at the age of 43. The very next day, Chennault was recruited by the Chinese Air Force, who was eager to have him lead the Chinese fighter pilots in training. Tensions between China and Japan were growing, and by the summer of 1941, they were at war with each other. As a result, Chennault immediately rose to the position of commander and advisor of the Chinese Air Force, and would later go on to lead his own wing, known as the American Volunteer Group, AVG. In 1937, the Sino-Soviet Treaty, a non-aggression pact between the Soviet Union and China, was signed. The Soviets helped to supply fighter aircraft and bombers to their newly found allies, which were utilized by Chennault for 2 years in order to ward off Japanese attacks. However, by 1940, the Chinese defense had been overwhelmed by the Japanese, resulting in the destruction of the majority of their air force. This also ended most of the support they were receiving from the Soviet Union. As a result, the Chinese were desperate for planes and eventually turned to the US for assistance. At the time, the US was not involved in the war, but President Roosevelt couldn't stand the idea of Japan defeating China before turning its attention to his country. Chennault then made the trip to the US to see what he could in order to acquire planes. He met with a Chinese official, T.V. Soong, in Washington, D.C., to try to get as many supplies as he could. After negotiations were made, the Chinese Air Force purchased 100 American-made Curtiss P-40 fighter planes, also known as Warhawks. These aircraft were single-engine, single-seat ground attack planes made entirely of metal, and they were used heavily throughout the war by the Allied powers. With 13,738 total Warhawks manufactured, it was ranked the third most produced American-made fighter throughout World War II. The plane's iconic shark's mouth paint scheme wasn't added to the aircraft until later. The idea came about when a group of AVG pilots who were visiting friends noticed a picture of an airplane painted in the color scheme on the front cover of the Illustrated Weekly of India. This gave them the inspiration for the ferocious shark face. When Chennault was informed of this plan, he declared that all of their planes would be painted that way since he loved it so much. On paper, the American Volunteer Group's AVG planes didn't compare to Japan's aircraft. However, the pilots of the AVG later learned to successfully exploit weaknesses in Japanese air forces while highlighting the strengths of their own. In order to better their chances, Chennault dispatched recruiters to American military bases. President Roosevelt allowed some men to go, but at the time it was against the law for any American military personnel to get involved in the conflict there. So President Roosevelt granted them permission to go, but all of the men that were recruited had to resign from their military positions beforehand. The AVG's recruitment process began in the summer of 1941 and extended into the fall. The crew consisted of 59 pilots from the Navy, 33 from the Army, and 7 from the Marines. On top of that, they also had a support crew of about 200 people. This would officially begin the American Volunteer Group, later known as the Flying Tigers. Less than 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor, on December 20th, 1941, they conducted their first combat mission and intercepted 10 Japanese bombers west of Kunming, China. One of the first aviation victories in the Pacific was achieved here. During a terribly dark time for everyone involved, this and many more daring deeds offered hope to the home front and the Allies. The Japanese bombers were caught off guard when Chennault's well-prepared squadron attacked them. The group was taught to use a diving attack by their fearless leader. Dive, shoot, then dive away, which worked effectively. This tactic increased the speed of their P-40s while reducing the risk of a counterattack. The Japanese had lost 9 bombers by the end of the battle, leaving only 1 for them to return with. Soon after, the Tigers would find themselves in combat near Rangoon, Burma. This time, the Tigers were assisting the British Air Force against Japanese attacks in defense of Rangoon, which played a key role in China's war efforts. The supply lines from China's coast were sealed off by Japan, which led China to depend on the port of Rangoon all the way to Burma Road in Kunming. In January and February of 1942, battles ensued in Japanese-controlled Thailand and Burma. The Tigers have since been given credit for taking down 299 Japanese airplanes, confirmed and unconfirmed. They also hold the record to this day of only losing 12 of their own men in combat. Despite being outnumbered, usually 4-1, the Tigers were able to put up a fierce fight against the oncoming Japanese, causing massive damage and hindering the enemy's attack. The Japanese Imperial Army would have stormed into Burma and likely would have established a foundation in China, if not for the resistance of the Flying Tigers and the British Royal Air Force. Out of the 50 air battles they were involved in, the Flying Tigers never lost one. Today, there are several monuments, memorials, and museum displays devoted to the Flying Tigers in China, the US, Taiwan, and Thailand. Frank Losonsky, the final surviving member of the original AVG, passed away in February 2020. What's the worst thing you've ever experienced while on a plane? Let us know in the comments, and while you're at it, hit that subscribe button. 2. The Lost Squadron. In the summer of 1942, a large-scale American invasion of the Pacific began. It set the stage for a lengthy campaign of island hopping and guerrilla warfare. After the U.S. defeated the Japanese at Midway and Guadalcanal, military troops across the world prepared for the Allied invasion of Europe. They increased the number of American troops and planes that were sent overseas in a mission known as Operation Bolero. 2 B-17 bombers and 6 P-38 fighters left Greenland at 3 a.m. on July 15, 1942, not knowing they would soon become involved in one of Bolero's most infamous missions. Before flying to Great Britain, the pilots intended to refuel in Iceland. However, when they were about 90 minutes from Reykjavik, they encountered a stretch of dense cloud cover which forced them to turn around and head back to Greenland. Unfortunately, they had to get ready for an emergency landing on the ice caps below, since they were already running low on fuel. The first aircraft to touch down, a P-38 piloted by Brad McManus, rolled onto its back, but the pilot was uninjured. The rest of the aircraft was right behind, which left the squad trapped on a desolate glacier near Køge Bay in southeastern Greenland. Luckily, everyone was still alive. A Special Air Force unit arrived at the accident site 9 days after the original landing and accompanied the 25-member crew on a 10-mile or 16-kilometer journey to the coast. When they finally arrived at their destination, they were picked up by a Coast Guard cutter. Sadly, the crew's airplanes were left behind, buried under the ice at a depth of 250 to 300 feet or 76 to 107 meters, seemingly forced to spend an eternity trapped on the glaciers of Greenland. The operation was dubbed the Lost Squadron, which proved to be a suitable name, at least until 1992. During this year, one of the P-38's, Glacier Girl, was saved and given a second chance at flight. Robert Wilson's aircraft, Echo, another P-38, was also located. This left only 6 of the original squadrons still trapped underneath the ice caps of Greenland. In 2011, while performing radar scans in the area, researchers from the organization Arctic Hotpoint Solutions discovered Echo. They came back in early 2018 with drones outfitted with ground-penetrating radar. After locating the plane's final resting place, the team confirmed its identification by melting through several layers of thick ice using a heat probe driven by a high-pressure washer system. According to Tom Metcalf, who reports for Live Science, the probe came back coated in hydraulic fluid, a definite indicator that it made contact with the submerged aircraft. Atlanta businessmen Pat Epps and Richard Taylor were largely responsible for the first Lost Squadron ship being found, Glacier Girl. They co-founded the Greenland Expedition Society in 1981. and Epps, Taylor, and Kentucky businessman Roy Schaffner spent over 10 years devising a recovery plan. In order to salvage the planes, they would have to somehow release the aircraft from 300 feet or 91 meters of solid ice. A 17-foot-long, 5-meter, 3-ton chunk of metal from Glacier Girl's center was finally liberated on August 1, 1992, concluding the 11-year struggle for the team. The fighter made a victorious comeback in October of 2002, 60 long years after the initial incident took place. The plane was showcased in a number of special occasions and air performances around the country following its return to service. With the help of advanced technology, Echo will soon be able to join Glacier Girl in the skies once again. Its location has already been discovered, and the rescue team is currently working on recovering it from the ice. 1. Ghost Bomber. On the 23rd of November 1944, an anti-aircraft unit stationed outside of Kortenberg, Belgium, working for the Royal Air Force, noticed a B-17 Flying Fortress heading in their direction. The enormous U.S. bomber from the Army Air Forces approached quickly with its landing gears already down. The ground crew assumed it was an emergency landing because there was no scheduled landing set to take place, so they responded accordingly. With the pilot of the Flying Fortress unable to land effectively, it plowed into a field nearby. The aircraft's landing was so quick and erratic that the propellers broke off and both wings slammed into the ground during the fall. After narrowly avoiding a collision with the unit's weapons, soldiers on the ground waited for over 15 minutes for the bomber's crew to appear from the wreckage, but no one emerged. After another 5 minutes passed without any sign of life, Major John V. Crisp approached the B-17 cautiously. It took him a while to locate an entrance hatch due to his lack of familiarity with the aircraft. However, the Major eventually found the hatch under the fuselage, opened it, and entered the bomber by himself. Upon searching, 12 neatly wrapped parachutes were found, making this occurrence even more strange. Surprisingly, the crew of the crashed B-17 was nowhere in sight. The only clue Major Crisp discovered was from the code book he found in the wreckage, with the last note reading, "Bad flak." In most cases, flak refers to explosive shells from an anti-aircraft weapon. But in spite of this statement, the bomber merely experienced landing-related damage. For a while, it was unclear what may have happened to the B-17, which later earned the nickname Phantom Fortress. The 91st Bombardment Group's involvement with the aircraft itself was verified. The Phantom's last known mission was supposedly bombing oil refineries in Merseburg, Germany, but apparently something went horribly wrong. Amazingly, the Phantom's crew was located in Belgium, alive and well. They claimed that the plane's bomb rack became problematic. As they turned away from their group to fix the issue, they were hit by enemy fire, further damaging the rack and destroying one of the engines. When it became evident that the bomber wouldn't make it, the crew opted to turn around and aim for Belgium instead of England. To keep the B-17 in the air, they discarded extra weight along the route. The Phantom's crew decided to get out after things continued to deteriorate. They said they put the aircraft on autopilot before bailing out of the plane. However, the bomber didn't appear to have any of the damage the crew said it did, contradicting their account of events. Attempts to uncover the real story continued, and although it seems odd, the Phantom's crew may have been telling the truth. After the crew bailed from the aircraft, the engines may have restarted on their own. Due to their ignorance and limited knowledge of flak damage from the departing end, the original investigators might have confused fighting damage with crash damage. The ideas are probable, but none explained why the crew's parachutes remained on board. Investigators have also been unable to determine how the bomber was able to land in what appeared to be one piece, which is the most challenging aspect of flying. The unmanned crash landing of the Phantom was a first, and many people were curious as to how it occurred. The most effective idea ultimately came down to chance. The bomber accidentally made a crash landing in a way that only a legendary bomber pilot could potentially achieve by dropping altitude at the correct speed and angle for a fall. The Phantom's autonomous landing is still one of the many odd and mystifying occurrences that have been known to happen during combat, and none of them have been fully explained to this day. If you were on a failing plane, would you try to escape using a parachute, or would you trust the pilot if he claimed he could make a successful emergency landing? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.